Okay, let's move along then to Article 3. If I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. I will make every effort to escape and aid others to escape. Okay, now I mentioned earlier that there is part of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 that applies to AMED personnel that is very important, and now would be a good time to insert it. It has to do with our status. If you as a doctor, physician, dentist, I'm sorry the veterinarian officers and enlisted personnel don't qualify for this, but if you are in this kind of situation and are captured, you are protected by a status that is known as retained status, R-E-T-A-I-N-E-D. And what this means is very important. Two things. One, you are allowed to continue to practice medicine. You are supposed to be allowed to continue to perform the mission for which you were trained, and that is helping people who are sick and wounded. And the second thing is that as soon as your services are no longer required, then you are supposed to be released back to friendly forces. Okay, that's very important. So the exception here is that because of this retained status, you are not allowed to effect an escape attempt because of the fact that you are allowed to treat patients. Now, the question always comes up, what happens if I'm not being treated as a POW? Okay, there was one physician during the Vietnam War that spent 5 years in a North Vietnamese POW camp. He was treated as a POW. He was not allowed to treat patients. Obviously, the Geneva Convention was not being followed. We could get into this. We could discuss that for hours, couldn't we? What kind of status do you find yourself in? If the enemy is treating you as a POW, then your actions might be looked on a little bit differently. Okay? We still have the requirement here as AMED personnel to act as retained persons. But this is something that is going to be an individual type thing if you ever find yourself in that situation. And obviously the last part, I will accept neither parole nor special favors from the enemy, means that we are not allowed to accept anything favor-wise that would give us a better position than our comrades who find themselves in the same situation. This happened a great deal in North Korean POW camps, unfortunately, because of the fact that people did not have the self-discipline to act properly. The North Koreans were able, by psychological indoctrination, to induce them to do things for them, to act as plants within squads to give information to the enemy. And this is one of the reasons why escape attempts were not possible, because there was a plant in each little group of men. These things happen, unfortunately, and it is because of the lack of training and proper discipline that they came about. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
By carrying a weapon and engaging in active defensive maneuvers, haven't you given up your status to some extent?
Okay, good question. Major McGuire's question was, by carrying a weapon and being involved in defensive maneuvers, do you give up this right here? Under the Geneva Convention, as long as you are involved in defensive measures with either, and the defensive weapons, M16 rifles and 45s are classified as defensive weapons, trying to protect yourself, your patient, or your medical treatment facility, if you're captured while in a defensive position, you are still retained personnel. And you fall under that Geneva Convention article there. If, as I mentioned earlier, you effect a breakout and in an offensive situation and get captured after that, then you are not protected by that article. In other words, if you're captured, you're a POW.
You still wear the Red Cross?
After you, while in a retained status?
In that particular situation that we're talking about, where you're actually engaged in an active defensive maneuver.
Do you still wear the Red Cross? Yes. And of course, the tactical commander A lot of times it depends on the situation whereby, under the Geneva Convention, of course, we are supposed to display the Red Cross on all buildings and on personnel who are treating patients so that they can be protected under the Geneva Convention.
And the commander, under no circumstances, can ask you to engage in an active offensive situation. He can't call on your medical troops.
The tactical commander, he is not supposed to ask you to become involved in that unless, of course, it's that type of situation where you have to defend yourself.
But you can refuse him otherwise.
Well, that gets into a tricky area there. You know, I know the answer. It depends on the situation. Does not answer your question. But as many situations as we came up with, we would have as many answers on that point. And if you'd like to see me after class, we can go into a few of these and hash them out. I'd be happy to. Yes, sir.
You're mentioning part of the potential for survival in any kind of a confined situation is a belief, you know, be it in God, but isn't also part of it isn't a realistic expectation of what one can expect? For instance, as medical personnel, we're supposed to have this retained status. But when in actuality, for all intents and purposes, this doesn't exist under this current mode of warfare that we're experiencing throughout the world. Now, you think that we are doing ourselves a disservice by telling ourselves that we are going to have these privileges when in fact they probably won't be offered to us?
Are we doing ourselves a disservice? I think we would be from the standpoint if people are not trained in knowing what to expect. One of the studies that was done after the Korean conflict showed that the main reason that people had so much trouble in handling the situation was because of their ignorance of what to expect in a prisoner of war situation. Now, depending on what kind of conflict we got into and whether the country that we were fighting was a signer of the Geneva Convention would probably and possibly change the situation.
Do you think the Geneva Conventions, as they are used now, are in fact a viable document, knowing the probable adversaries you're faced with?
I feel it is if, you know, we as a country, we honor it. Okay. Now, the problem is if you're fighting somebody who does not honor it. And in that situation, I don't know if I'm getting across what you're asking, but it is the best document that we have at the present time that countries have signed as an official act, and that therefore they are bound legally and morally to following it. If they don't, we get into another area here of international relations that I am not prepared to comment on. So, from that standpoint, we have to have laws that we can commit ourselves to both in peacetime and wartime, or we turn into an uncivilized society. And that's about all I can comment on that right now. Okay, let's move along to Article 4. It's a long one if you just go ahead and read that quickly there. Can you see a point here that we would consider an exception? And this goes back to our retained status now. Goes back to our retained status. We are not officially POWs. Command situation, good. In the Army Medical Department, the only corps that is authorized to accept command of other POWs is the Medical Service Corps. Because we are not, from that standpoint, it's kind of a dual type thing. Under the Geneva Convention, we still qualify as retained persons because of our admin training to administrate over a medical treatment facility. But at the same time, we're the only branch, therefore, that can command and take charge of other POWs. So it's kind of a dual, we're a two-hatted type thing. But that is the exception. So you as a doctor, a dentist, whatever, you find yourself in this situation retain status. The only thing you are responsible for is whatever medical treatment facility you would have in a POW camp, regardless of rank. If you have a full colonel, medical corps, who is there treating patients, and the highest ranking officer of another branch, other than the Army Medical Department, is a captain, then that person is in charge. This is rank irregardless here. Very important point. And obviously the other parts of this apply as far as giving them information, obeying lawful orders, and backing up those people who are in command over you. All of this applies. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Would the enemy use you to, like, to work in one of the hospitals to treat their soldiers, or just would you be in charge just of your fellow soldiers?
That's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. What happens if you find yourself in a situation where the enemy wants you to treat their sick and wounded also? Possibly even before you're allowed to treat your own. What do you do? What if they don't let you treat yours before you treat theirs?
You have to treat them to respect the treatment of your own troops.
Okay. If a person, an enemy, is sick or wounded to the point that he is not capable of performing his mission, he is no longer a combatant, is he? And at that point, for you who are physicians here and have taken the Hippocratic Oath, what are you supposed to do for that person? Treat him. This has even been put in writing in some places in the European theater. I understand it is in writing that if this situation ever occurs, that personnel, Army Medical Department personnel, will treat both enemy and American personnel the same way, irregardless of who they are. And so that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up because it happens. It can happen, and chances are it will happen, because for the most part, when you get in that kind of situation, our medical personnel are trained better than some other countries. And so they know what we know and know that we can treat their people. So I appreciate that question because it does come up. Yes, sir.
You say only if they're wounded so that they can never be a combatant again? What if they're...
No, so once a person becomes a non-combatant because of illness or injury, okay, he is to be treated on the same footing as anybody else who is sick and wounded. He is in need of medical care.
Okay, so even if he knew that what you did would enable him to fight again, say, in a week?
That's right. Exactly right.
Seems like they would always have something for you to do, and they wouldn't return you to, you know, like...
That's always a possibility we have to look at, don't we? That they would not, that they would have so much for a person to do that they would not return them. That is always a possibility we have to face. Because realizing that there are not that many medical department personnel that far forward that the chances are that great of capture, that, you know, would you ever find yourself in an excess position? Probably not, possibly not. But it is a possibility. Anything else on that? Article 5, I think, is probably the most familiar from the standpoint of the Geneva Convention articles. And it was written into the Code of Conduct to reiterate our responsibility as far as what information we give the enemy to effect positive identification. Name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Okay, now, just a couple of quick changes on this that have already taken place. If on your handout you will cross out the word bound and put required, I am bound to give, the word has been changed to required, and the word only has been stricken. So now it reads, I am required to give name, rank, service number, and date of birth. And the exception here is, obviously, that if you have a patient or patients there that are in need of more medical care, more definitive care than you can give, then you have the responsibility to give any information based on that patient's condition to the appropriate camp authorities. Somebody needs a transfusion, an operation, medication that you don't have, obviously they need to know about that patient's condition. Has anyone here read Commander Bucher's book, My Story? Think back to, what was it, 1968, I believe, when the Pueblo was captured. The North Koreans had the vessel. They had all the intelligence gathering equipment in the thing. Very little was able to be destroyed. Yet the people were continually interrogated over and over and over again. What kind of information were they trying to get?
Verification. Certain uses of certain stuff.
Okay, verification of what it was used for one thing. What did they use for the most part, the information that they got out of prisoners for? Was it for tactical intelligence? Or what was it for? Propaganda, exactly. The information they were trying to get was things like, yes, I was in territorial waters, yes, I am an aggressor type thing, we were in the wrong, we shouldn't be here, things like this. Not anything having to do with tactical intelligence, but rather for propaganda purposes. And several years after this, a retired naval admiral wrote a book questioning this. And there are a lot of thoughts being raised, both pro and con, reference just how much information should an American serviceman be required or allowed to give the enemy to keep himself from being tortured. You know, where do you draw the line? Some people say there's nothing wrong with this, that we have a responsibility to give the enemy no information at all, because anything you give just leads to possibly more and more and more as you go along. And this is where the brainwashing came in. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the people that say, listen, what is the use of getting American servicemen tortured when all they're trying to get is information to use for propaganda? Put them on radio, on television, the guy says, I did something wrong, my country did something wrong. And it's even been suggested, and I'm just giving this out as information on both sides of this continuum here, that people say, why don't we allow them to say anything that will keep them from getting tortured, as long as the information is not significant, and then we as a country will put out to the world that these statements were made under physical or psychological duress, the person is not responsible, and they have our permission to say anything that the enemy uses for propaganda purposes. What do you think about that?
I think an interesting point to that latter statement is the fact that usually the greatest impact of any announcement is the first announcement, be it right or wrong. A good example being a lot of Ralph Nader's information that he gives to the public.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Okay.
some of it has a factual basis, but it's been proven that some of the stuff that he's put out, especially about the Corvair, a good example,
Yes.
was erroneous, but the public thinks that the Corvair was a bad car. And this is the lasting impression that's been given the public, even though subsequent information came out refuting some of the original documentation.
Okay, so then apply that now to a POW situation.
Okay, you're a third country, and a prisoner of war comes out and says, well, my country is bombing hospitals or civilian residences, which are, which is illegal under the Geneva Conventions.
Mm-hmm.
This third country person is going to say, well, gee, this POW is representing a bad country, even though maybe a week later the involved country will come back and say, well, this is all erroneous or was under duress. I think the original impression has been made, and it will have the greater impact than the rebuttal.
That's a good point. Okay, where do you draw the line? That's always the thing, that these questions are being talked about now in Congress, There's a lot of concern over if we get ourselves in another situation, find ourselves in a situation like this, just how is the American serviceman going to come out? How is he going to come out? It appeared to be a failure in North Korea during the Korean conflict because people were not prepared. We've gone over a lot of information here real quickly, but what I think we need to remember is that there is a code of conduct. It does lay down very specific responsibilities and rules for the American servicemen. These things were designed to be helpful, not to be a hindrance, but rather to be a help if we ever find ourselves in a situation where we need it. And while we don't memorize this thing verbatim, as long as we realize that we have certain responsibilities as soldiers, regardless of our branch of service, we'll know that the enemy cannot use this type of information against us. And that's the important thing. I thank you for your time and attention, and class is dismissed.